In this chapter, we're going to look at a few more basic user interface components that come with Kendo. We've handled buttons in the last chapter, so now we'll see how to add different kinds of inputs to our forms, including sliders, drop-downs, and text areas. We'll also convert our detail page interface to use a tabbed layout, and we'll complete the dashboard filtering requirements by adding a combo box for assignee selection. Just like we did in the last chapter, we're going to be referring to the documentation on the Kendo UI for Angular website. So make sure you have that open and handy because we're going to be doing some exercises as well. And we're going to start off with inputs next. Open up the documentation for Kendo for Angular and find the components section and open up the inputs overview. We'll start here. As you can see, we have a bunch of different inputs available for us to use. We're going to start off simple with the TextBox and TextArea inputs. I already have the project that we're working on running in the background here on localhost 4200 and Kendo UI already implemented on port 4201 as a reference. I'm going to go to the backlog page and tap on this Add button. This will bring up a modal dialog. We're going to be converting these inputs to Kendo inputs, just like you see here. We have a little bit of animation already added in, and that adds a little bit of user friendliness to our form. Before you watch me show you how to do it here, I'll invite you to pause the video and try to convert the form inputs to Kendo inputs. Here is the project without Kendo implemented. I'm going to head over to backlog and tap on the Add button, and you'll see that we have a regular form with regular input and text area right here. This is what I want you to convert. And let's take a look at the code. You'll be able to find the form here in the modules folder, in backlog, under pages, backlog, backlog page component, and down at the bottom of this HTML file, you'll see a modal dialog. This modal dialog has a form, and it has an input and a text area. I want you to try to convert the form inputs to Kendo inputs. See if you can do this yourself, and then come back and watch me do it. Go ahead and pause the video right here. Okay, hopefully you were able to successfully add the input and the text area. If not, then that's okay. This is the first one we're doing on our own. So let me show you how it's done. I'm going to start off on the Kendo documentation and the inputs section. And we don't have this installed yet. So I'm going to use the Angular CLI to add the Kendo Angular inputs package into our project. I'm going to copy this code, and I'm going to open up the terminal and terminate the running process by hitting Control-C here. And right in the project directory, I'm going to paste in that command, ng add progress / kendo-angular-inputs. We've seen an example of this earlier. This will add the npm packages to our project required by the inputs. So now it's done. Let's go take a look at our project. First, I'll start at package.json. You'll see that we have this new package that was added, and that's all the setup we need to do. Let's go ahead and actually implement the inputs. In this lesson, we're going to implement one of the inputs in our add item form. Make sure you go ahead to your project directory and start up the server again with the ng serve command. That way the server is running in the background and your application is live, syncing and building. Let's save all our files and take a look at the backlog page component, which is found in the app folder, then modules, backlog, pages, backlog, and backlog page component. That's a long path, I know. Okay, so here at the bottom, we have a form. That's actually a Bootstrap modal dialog, and it pops up when you tap the Add button. This gives us a quick interface to add a new backlog item. Here I'm going to add a new item. I'll give it a title and description and the item type. Item type is whether it's a bug or a product, backlog item, or a chore, etc. Backlog. When I save changes, you'll see that the item shows up here in the list. The items show up. Let's go ahead and convert this top input into a Kendo text box input. Going back to the documentation, we're going to be using this text box right here. And the simplest example is just the text box input. Before you watch me show you how to do it, try to convert both this title input and this description text area to Kendo UI yourself. And then come back, and if you have any issues doing it, you'll see how it's done. Go ahead and pause the video. We'll be doing a few exercises like this throughout the course, and see if you can get this done and then come back here. Okay, hopefully you were successful. If not, don't worry. Let me show you how it's done now. We're going to start with this input here, and we're going to replace this with the Kendo TextBox component. And since it's going to get its own styling, I can remove the class that's coming from Bootstrap, and that's the form control class, but our binding remains the same. And since we're inside the form element, we need to have the name here to make sure your inputs have the name, and importantly, that they have different names for every input. Now there's one other thing we need to do that we haven't done yet. And if you remember from the previous chapter, things are not going to work as expected just yet. But let's have a look so we can reinforce this. If we go to the add form, you'll see that there's nothing there. Well, our text box is not there. That's because the new component we used is not known to Angular right now. Now we didn't get an error yet, and the app still works, and that's because in HTML, an unknown element like this is usually ignored. But if it's a registered element, then this will be rendered. However, Kendo TextBox is not registered yet, so we need to import it just like we did with the button in the previous chapter. So let's go back to the backlog page TypeScript file, and we're going to import it here. This is coming from the Progress Kendo Angular Inputs package. There's a utility array we can import again, and that's the Kendo TextBox utility array, which we'll also need to add to our imports in the component declaration right here. Now we've given meaning to this Kendo TextBox component in our template, and if we take a look at our form now, you'll see that it's there, styled as a Kendo input. All right, in the last lesson, you saw me convert an input for the title into a Kendo input. Now I want you to try doing this description text area yourself. You can use the documentation for help. In fact, I encourage it. You can find that under Components, then Inputs, and then take a look at the TextArea for some help. This will give you the example, the source code, and you can play around with it by using this Stack Blitz link, which will show you a working example. Okay, did you try that? Let's go ahead and do it together now. Just like before, we're going to convert this text area into a Kendo text area, and that's the name of the component. We also need to go to the code and import the Kendo TextArea utility array from the Kendo Angular Inputs package. Also, don't forget to add it to the imports of the component as well. When that's done, your description is suddenly a Kendo-based component, and it looks just like the HTML version. So how do you know that this is the Kendo one? Well, you can always open up developer tools by hitting F12 in the browser that you're using, select the actual component, and then you'll be able to see that this is in fact a Kendo text area with all the different Kendo classes that are applied to it. By the way, we also don't need the form control class here because that's a Bootstrap class, so we can remove that safely. Now, if we take a look at the completed application, there's still one more thing we need to finish to make these animated placeholders. In your exercise, did you guess what that was? Well, let me show you how that's done too. I didn't let you know that this is an entirely different package. Instead of inputs, you're going to be using labels, and specifically, in this case, the floating label. If we have a look at the overview for that, you'll see that there's an example right there for the floating label. And here, if I focus on the field, that's exactly the effect that we're looking for. It's a placeholder that animates into a label. Now, how do we get this into our application? Simple. Let's go to the installation, and as usual, we're going to add a new package, Kendo Angular Label. And yes, you can copy this Angular CLI command and have it automatically install this for you, but I want to show you a different approach. I want to show you how you can do this manually, because in this case, it's pretty simple. If we take a look at the manual installation steps, we're going to install just this package. These other packages are already installed from the previous installations we've done, so we don't need to do that again. So I'm going to copy just the package name, and in our project, let's go to the package.json file, and under all the progress components, I'm going to add that progress Kendo Angular label to our list of packages. I'll save the package.json file, and now that I've changed the file, I need to head out to the terminal, terminate the running process, and run npm install so that the packages in the package.json file are picked up and the missing ones are installed. Once that package is installed, I can run ng-serve again to kick up the server. But this time, instead of using the component in our template, we're going to do the import first. This import is coming from Progress Kendo Angular Label, and this is the Kendo Floating Label Utility Array. which we also need to add to our imports array for the component. Now that we've added it to the code, we can freely use this in our HTML template. We already have our previous labels here. Is it just a matter of replacing the previous labels with this floating label? Well, not exactly. Let's take a quick look at the documentation to see how it's used. Under floating label and overview, we'll take a look at the source here, and you'll see that it's slightly different to apply a Kendo floating label here. We're going to wrap the existing input component with the floating label component. I'll just copy this right here, and let's head over to our Kendo text box. And instead of this div, I will just wrap this Kendo text box with the floating label. Enter age is not appropriate here. Let's just rename this as title. We also don't need this HTML label anymore, so let's get rid of that. And let's have a look. I'll open up my modal dialog, and there's our title. If I focus in on the text box, the title animates out. So that's exactly the behavior that we want. Let's do the same thing with the description label. I'm going to remove the div and the label that's currently there, and I'm going to copy this Kendo floating label wrapper component and wrap the Kendo TextArea with it. And here I'm going to set the text to description. And there we go. Description is now animated as well. Now you'll also see that there's a couple of inconsistencies in the UI. Item type is still a label, an HTML label that is, and these fields don't exactly align. So let's fix that up as well since we're here. Now it doesn't really make sense for a drop-down select to have a floating label because it's not really going to float since we always have a value in it. But I'm going to use the floating label here anyway, just for the sake of consistency. This is going to be item type. So now we have the title, description, and item type all looking consistent. Item type is not floating, of course, but at least it's positioned correctly and it looks the same as the other ones. There's a couple of other things we can fix up here. For example, we no longer need the row class from the Bootstrap library on these. So let's remove that, and it's going to fix the way our form looks. We fixed the padding and the margin issue with the floating labels, but now our fields don't stretch all the way across. So we can apply a style to the floating label and set the width to 100% across all three of these fields. Okay, that looks much better. Let's create a new item. Description is optional, but let's put that in, and this will be a bug. Save changes. There we go. Now, in the form, there's also a drop-down here that's a simple HTML select. As the next exercise, I'd like you to implement this as a drop-down list from the Kendo UI library. Specifically, you'll be using the Dropdowns package and then the drop-down list component. That way, it gets all the Kendo UI styling, and this is an exercise I will leave to you. We'll do more of these in the next lesson. If you did the last exercise in the previous lesson, then you might have already added a drop-down list in the add item form. In this lesson, we'll switch over to the item detail form where I've already updated the input and the text area similar to how we did it in the add item form. Now I'll change the HTML selects for the item type, status, and priority to Kendo dropdowns. I'll also add a couple of templates so that we get visual feedback on what we're selecting. Of course, this is your chance to get ahead of me and try this yourself. Here's what it looks like in the completed application. If we take a look at the details for one of these items, you'll see that the item type has a Kendo drop-down list with different item types available and the icons associated with them. The status is just a regular drop-down, so this one would be the simplest to implement. It's not going to require a template. And the priority one has a template for each item as well. So go ahead and try this and come back here when you're done. Okay, let's go ahead and do this together now. In order to get the drop-down lists, we need to install a separate component package. We need to first go through the installation again. Remember, each one of these comes as a separate package. That way, if you're not using it, you don't have to install it, which keeps your production bundle size down. I'm going to go ahead and copy this line of code and add the Kendo Angular dropdowns to our project. Let's switch to the terminal. Control-C to terminate the running process, and I'm going to paste and execute this line, same as we've done before. Once this completes, I'm going to issue the ngserve command again to kick off the server. While that's building, let's take a look at the code and the changes we need to make. Open up the ptitemFormComponent.html template file. If you don't already have it open, that's going to be in Modules, Backlog, Components, Detail, Item Detail, and then ptitemFormComponent.html. You can see that the first two fields of the form are already done in Kendo format. That's the title input and the description text area. Let's start off by going to the status area right here. This is the status field. Right now, we just have a regular HTML select here, and we're going to convert this to a Kendo dropdown list. In our code, we have a statuses provider, which is just an array of string values. And for every option here, we're iterating over that array and rendering an option in the select. When one of the values is selected, our ng model is bound to the itemForm.status string. So it's being saved to that itemForm object, which is the model representation of the entire form. It's just a plain JavaScript object. If we take a look at it here, you can see right here, public item form. It's a PT item detail edit model form type, which is just an interface, and it has plain values, numbers, and strings. We also have this event here on the select, ng model change. This triggers on dropdown change. Any dropdown that we have here will trigger that event. So for example, for item type, we have that triggered, and drop down here for priority, we also have that triggered. Now what that event does is, let's take a look at the code. What that event does is it notifies the item was updated. At which point the item saved event gets emitted. All that does is basically notify the parent page component, that's the details page, to save this item. So anytime any of these fields change, it's going to notify and it's going to save the item. Pretty standard Angular stuff. Let's go back to the status field. I'm going to keep this select here for reference while we're switching over to Kendo dropdown lists. Right here, I'm going to insert the Kendo dropdown list component. We need to provide some data for it. So this component has a data attribute. We need to bind the data attribute to the statuses provider. The statuses provider is this array of strings that we're iterating over down here. So I'm going to just use that directly as the data for the Kendo dropdown list. Just take a look at the documentation for the dropdown list under data binding. You can bind this dropdown list to arrays of primitive data like we're doing here with the string array, or you can bind to arrays of complex data. And there's instructions on how to do each one of these. So back here, once a value is selected, we're going to need to bind the ng model to the itemForm.status string property so that it can be saved. And that's exactly what we were doing here before. The Kendo dropdown list also issues a value change event whenever you select something. So whenever we selected something in our old select, we triggered the onDropdown change event. There really is no reason to change that. Let's just reuse it. Now, because we're also dealing with a form here, we need a name property for our dropdown list, and that's going to be item statuses. And that's going to be item status. At this point, you already know that you need to go to the code and import the components up here. This one is coming from the Angular dropdowns, and it's the Kendo dropdown list, which we also need to add to our component imports. And that completes our Kendo dropdown list. One more thing we need to do so we don't confuse the form. I'm going to delete our select here. We were just using that to copy values and properties out of. Let's save and take a look at what we have. Here's our application, and notice the status field looks quite different than the regular selects. So here's a regular HTML select, and the status is the Kendo dropdown list. It has animation that slides out, and you can select it just like you did before. By the way, this theme that we're using is the default theme. We're going to be modifying the theme later on in this course. Every time I change this and select a new option, this whole item is saved, and that's something we don't have to worry about. That's handled by the API and what we already have running in the background. There's other events that are available in the dropdowns. The dropdown list is a pretty powerful component. You can either use it simply like we did here, or you can have it load data asynchronously using the async pipe. You can stream data to it using RxJS observables, and everything is well documented. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at another feature of the dropdown list, and that's using the item template. Here's an example of it with some numbers in there, but we're going to be using it to display icons and badges. In the previous lesson, we've implemented a simple status dropdown that's bound to an array of strings. Let's take that a little bit further and convert our item type select to a Kendo dropdown list. And we'll add some templating. If you want to try this for yourself before you watch me do it, this is the final result that you're looking for. You want to have the bug icon for the bug, PBI icon for the PBI, and so on. And for the priorities, you want to have the bootstrap badge styling here, along with the text for each of the different priority levels. Okay, let's do this together now. For templating, there is another directive that we can use right inside of the Kendo dropdown list. We've already done statuses, so I'm going to copy the work we've finished there, and I'm going to paste it here under priority. Make sure you change the name to priority. Otherwise, the form will get confused. For the binding of the data, we're going to bind to our priorities provider. The ng model is going to be bound to item form priority string. And our value change event can still trigger on the dropdown change. That's fine. I'm going to delete the select now, and let's see how far we got with just that. There we go. There's priority, and it's working. The dropdown is bound to all the different priorities that are available, which is just another array of strings right now. Great. So now we just need to get some badges in there to style that properly. And we can do that thanks to the item templates. If we take a look at the example in the documentation, you can see how easy it is to implement. All we need to do is just add an ng template right here inside of our Kendo dropdown list component. Let's do that. Back in the code, inside the Kendo dropdown list for priorities, I'm going to add ng template, and this ng template has a special Kendo dropdown list item template directive. We also want to have each item available inside the template. And we do that using the let syntax. Let data item. This will create a template variable called data item inside the template that we can use. Since data item is a string, we can just have a span in here, and we can bind data item directly, which will just render the string inside each option. So this should be equivalent to what we already have now. And yes, we are getting that data item, but we didn't really do anything to make it look better. So each one of these data items is different because we're binding to a list of priorities. If we take a look at the priorities provider inside the code, you'll see that it's hard-coded as a constant. I'm going to hit F12 here to navigate there, and here are the priorities. So we have a priority enum, and the list of priorities is exposed as each one of the priorities from the enum. There's our enum, and the enum has a namespace that has all these extra functions on it, including one called getIndicatorClass. There's a lot of different ways of styling these items differently. This application just happens to use an enum with a function attached to the enum. So we're going to utilize that function. Back in the PT item details component, let's go in here into the code, and I'm going to create a new function here called getPriorityClass. This will take in a priority as a parameter, which is of type priority enum, and it will return a string, which is going to be the class name, the CSS class name. So our priority enum has some functions on it, including this getIndicatorClass, which I just showed you. I'm going to pass in the priority into the static method, and this will return us a string. I'll return the string directly from the function, and we can use this getPriority class now inside of our template. So here for the span, I'm going to data bind the CSS class attribute, and I'm going to use the Bootstrap badge class, but I'm also going to append a specific class that we're going to get returned here based on each priority. I'll call getPriority class and pass in the data item, which happens to be the priority inside the template. And if I did everything right, let's have a look. And here we go. Now each one of our priorities in the dropdown is a Bootstrap badge, and each has a different color based on the priority that it is. A low priority, which is blue, then we got medium, high, and finally critical has this deep red priority color. So that's templates. Let's quickly add another template to our item type. You already know how to do this, so this is something you can definitely try on your own. We're going to add icons though here instead of just badges. I'm going to copy this drop-down list along with the ng template. And let's go up here in our form to item type. And right inside here, I'm going to paste that in alongside the select, which we'll remove in a minute. We just need the item types provider for the data. We need the item form type string for the ng model. The value change event can stay the same, and the name should be item type. I'm going to remove this class binding here for the span, and let's test this out to make sure this works so far before we add the image. Oh, I forgot to remove the select. Let's do that. And let's have a look now. There's the item type, PBI, bug, chore, and impediment. This seems to be working just fine. Now let's add our image. So alongside the name, I'm going to add an image tag, and I'm going to data bind the source. We'll do that momentarily. Let's give our image a class of backlog item. Now, how do we get the source for each image? Well, just like for priorities, the item types have a helper function that helps get what image we're going to display for each item. In fact, we're already doing this on the backlog page right here. So we're showing a different image based on the item type. So let's go into the form here, and for the image source, I'm going to create a helper function called getIndicatorImage. Let's pass in the data bound data item, which happens to be the item type. So we just need to create this function in the code, and I'm going to create the getIndicatorImage, which is going to get an item type passed into it, which is of type PT item type. And this is going to return based on another static function coming from item type. So let's take a look at that function. Here's a static function. It's going to take in a PT item type and return an indicator. These are the icons I have in the project. Let's save everything and have a look. Well, we have an image there, but it's looking quite large and unstyled. So this is not going to work for us. We need to improve this template just a little bit, and that simply has to do with styling. I happen to have the CSS file referenced for this component, but if you take a look at the file, there's nothing in it right now. So I'm going to add a class here called backlogIcon, and I will limit the height to 20 pixels. So that's referring to this class that we already have applied here to the image. Let's have a look now. And there we go. There's our template with the icons for each of the item types. Let's quickly take a look at one more UI component that's useful in forms. And this one is useful for inputting number values between a minimum amount and a maximum amount. We have this field called estimate here in our form, which is currently just an HTML slider. We want to convert it to a Kendo UI slider. Let's take a look at the code in the PT item form component. And let's go to the HTML for that and find the estimate field right here. Currently, this is an input of type range, which renders as a slider in HTML. I'm going to keep that in here, but I'm going to add the Kendo slider next to it. And you might think, well, do I need to install the slider separately? But if we take a look at the documentation under inputs, there are many different kinds of inputs here. These are all form elements, and the slider is already there. So since we already installed it, we don't need to install anything new. We can just use it because we've already imported the input package. This is what the slider looks like. It's got a nice little animation built in and a number of options that we can use. So let's implement that here. The component is Kendo-slider, and we're going to copy the ng model and the blur event right from the input and attach it right into the Kendo slider. And data binding works the exact same way. This is two-way data bound to the item form estimate property. Whenever we leave the slider, we want to fire the event to save the item as well. Let's also copy the name attribute for the form, and we can delete the input. Now, since we're using the new component, we have to import it up here in the code that's coming from the inputs package, and it's a Kendo slider. Let's also add it to our component imports. And finally, let's have a look. There's our new slider in place. Now, because we didn't specify the minimum and the maximum, the slider will assume 0 to 10. That's the range. But we actually want to go from 0 to 20. So we can bind the min value to 0 and the max value to 20. You can see that the visual representation got a lot more ticks in between the two arrows here. We can control the ticks by adding the fixed tick width attribute and binding that to 10. There we go. A bit wider because each of the ticks has a value 10, which is 10 pixels. We can also bind something called small step. Here I'll set the value to 1. And what this will do is enable snapping the values to increments of 1 from 0 to 20. For more information about the slider, take a look at the documentation, as there are a lot of options you can set here. Let's implement one of the details requirements that we have, and that's converting this button interface to a tabbed interface. Since our details input is split up into multiple pages, this is a natural fit for a tabbed interface. I want you to notice, though, that when I tap on each one of these buttons here, the URL also changes. So if I go to chit-chat, the URL is chit-chat. If I go to tasks, the URL says tasks. And that allows us to deep link each one of these items into a subscreen on the item. We don't want to lose that functionality. We want to keep that, but we also want to turn these into tabs. So let's head over to the documentation. A TabStrip is a layout component, so it's going to be in the Layouts package. You'll find it under Layout, TabStrip, and let's take a look at the overview here. Here's an example of what the TabStrip looks like, and that's exactly what we want to implement. So under installation, we're going to need to install another package, and that's ng-add progress/Kendo Angular layout. Let's copy that. I'm going to head out to my terminal, Control-C to terminate the running process, paste in and execute this command. Once that's done, I'm going to start the server one more time. In order to implement the TabStrip, we're going to head out to the detail page component. That's the parent component of all the details. And that can be found in modules, backlog, pages, detail page component. Right now, we're switching on selected detail screen in order to switch between the selected screens. And then we're rendering the subcomponents, whether it's the form or tasks or chit-chat. So we're going to remove the switch statement and use the Kendo TabStrip instead. But for now, I'm going to leave the switch because we're going to copy some items from there. So let's just go ahead and add the Kendo TabStrip here. Each tab in the Kendo TabStrip has its own component, and that's called the Kendo TabStrip tab. You can give the tab a title. This is the title that actually shows up on the tab itself. And you can provide an ng template for the content of the tab. Now, to specify that this is going to be the tab content, we're going to use the Kendo tab content directive. So for the form content, we're going to use what we had here, which is the app item form component. I'm just going to copy or move it, doesn't matter what you do, right into that first tab. No changes necessary because the component is a standalone component, and that renders the body of the tab, which is the details form that we were working on before. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this one here and rename this to tasks. And I'm going to copy the tasks component from here and place it in the second tab. And we need one more. I'm going to call this one chit chat. And inside the content, we're going to have the app item chit chat component. Looks like we got all of them. We don't need the switch anymore, so I'm going to remove that. And of course, there's one more step. We need to open up the detail page component TypeScript code file and do our imports as usual. TabStrip is coming from the layout package, and the name of the convenience array is Kendo TabStrip. Let's add that to our imports array and check our app. And it works. But does it? Well, if we go to the Form tab, you'll see that our form seems to render, and that seems to work. If we go to Tasks, we're able to add tasks, and that's great. Same thing with ChitChat, but notice the URL is not changing. We need to fix that. And also, when we first go to this item, here I'm going to reload the page to show you this, there is no default item. Nothing shows up until you click one of the tabs first. So if you take a look at the documentation, you'll be able to find all the events that we need to implement this. Let's go back to the code and take care of that. The first thing we'll do is bind our tabs to the currently selected tab, whichever that might be. Each Kendo TabStrip tab has an attribute that we can bind, and that's called selected. We're going to create a new function here, and we're going to call this function isTabSelected. As a parameter, I'm going to pass in which tab we're looking at right now. So this one is Form, and I'll explain where this is coming from in a second. So for every one of these tabs, we're going to bind the selected attribute. This one is going to be Tasks, and this one's ChitChat. Let's go to the code and implement the function. This is the details page component TypeScript file. And let's go down a little bit over here. I'm going to create the public function called isTabSelected. And we're passing in the name of the screen. But it's not just a string. These screens have names and they're strongly typed. They're of type details screen type. So I'm going to copy that right here. And there we go. Details screen type. If I press F12 on that, you can see that we have only 3 types defined: Form, Tasks, and ChitChat. This is going to be important when we come back later in the course and implement the scheduler, because we're going to add one more type here. Okay, so this will tell us if the tab is selected. We already have a selected details screen in our component, which is going to return true or false based on the passed in value. And let's save that and take a look. Okay, and you can immediately see that by default, the Form screen is selected. As soon as the page is refreshed, that screen is shown. That's good. What if I change the URL to Tasks? That still works. Great. And ChitChat? That works as well. Why does that work? Because when we initialize the component, we check for the screen in the activated route, and then we set the selected detail screen to the passed in parameter. And that's why this tab selected works. However, there is one more thing missing. Notice if we navigate from tab to tab, then the URL doesn't change. So the URL doesn't get updated. Let's fix that too. There's one more event that we can leverage on the TabStrip, and that's on the TabStrip itself. This event is called TabSelect. When that event is triggered, we're going to call the onTabSelect function and pass in the event. Let's go ahead and create this function in the code. That can be right here under our TabSelected function. And the type of the event that we're getting passed in is actually a select event. If you take a look here, it's going to get auto-imported from Progress Kendo Angular Layout. So if you're strongly typing all your events, you're going to want to import that because that'll help you find out what's on the event args. And what we're going to use on the event args is the title. Title is a string, so we're going to convert that to lowercase first, and that'll match our detail screen type. And then I'm going to cast it to the detail screen type itself. Now we can set our selected detail screen to the currently selected screen. Finally, we can use our navigation service, which is a service we've implemented in the previous version of the application, and we can navigate to the correct page and also include the screen so that we can load the right tab. But we do need a quick check here, because if the screen is form, then we're not actually including that in the URL. That's going to be the default. But for the other two tabs, tasks and chit chat, we will include that in the URL. So we'll use navigation service to navigate and build up the URL, including the screen. Let's go ahead and save this and take a look. And I'm going to go directly to tasks. There we go. When I hit chit chat, the URL changes to chit chat as well. Great. So now everything is working. We have the TabStrip, the tabs. We can now navigate from screen to screen while updating the URL at the same time, allowing us to deep link. One more order of business, and that's just to clean up these buttons here that we're not going to use anymore. And that's at the top of the details page component. We have a div with the toolbar, and I'm just going to remove the entire toolbar. There we go. And that's the end of the TabStrip. There's one more component we want to take a look at, and that's the ComboBox. So let's come back to that next. There's one more component that we need to do on the dashboard, and this is a very interesting component, and it's the ComboBox. Luckily, we don't need to install anything else here because we've already installed the Dropdowns package. Let's add the ComboBox to our application. This is going on the dashboard page right at the top here where we're doing the rest of the filtering. We'll be filtering not only by date, but also by user. And the chart that we're going to be doing here later on also will be filtered by the user and the dates. At this time, we don't have a chart yet. All we have are the active issue statistics, but we do already have the functionality built into the API to handle everything. So we just need to add the ComboBox here. Go ahead and try this on your own before I show you how to do this. Even if you just get a ComboBox with some static strings in there, it'll be a good exercise for you. Okay, so in order to get this implemented, I'm going to close out my details page and components, and we're going to head out to the modules folder, dashboard, pages, dashboard, and then dashboard page component. We're going to do something a little different here with the ComboBox. We're going to bind asynchronously to an observable data source. Let's first create the ComboBox itself, and that's going to go right here next to the button group. The component is called Kendo ComboBox. I'm going to give this a placeholder with user as the string, and I'm going to give it an inline style here and set it to width of 250 pixels. That'll make it a little bit wider than the default. In the code, let's import Kendo ComboBox from progress, Kendo Angular Dropdowns, and we'll also add it to our imports array as usual. At this point, we should be experts at this by now. As soon as I have this saved, we should see the ComboBox appearing. And there it is. You'll see that the ComboBox is there, but there's no data there at this point because we're not loading any data yet. However, this is a fully functional ComboBox now. You can see our placeholders there. And we can even type text into it. Nothing's going to match, of course, because we don't have anything in there. And there's also a slight positioning problem. The ComboBox and the buttons should be on the right side of the dashboard header here. Let's fix that up real quick. That just has to do with the width. The header is taking up 700 pixels. We remove that and we are good to go. Now, how are we going to get data into our ComboBox? The ComboBox does have a data attribute that we can bind, and we can bind this to a simple array of strings as usual, or we can bind this to objects. Let's go to our code, and at this point in time, we don't have access to any users in this component. So we need to load up our users to make them available for the ComboBox to show. In our app, we have something called a user service that we've implemented in the previous version of the application. Let's inject the user service into this component using dependency injection. Right in the constructor, I'm going to create a private user service, and it's going to be of type PT_user_service. Our user service has a way to fetch the users, but when it fetches the users, it's not going to return them here. It's going to store them in a global store that we have here, which is another service that we're importing. The details of the implementation of the store are not really in the scope of this course. If you're curious, you can check the code out for yourself. But the important thing to know is that the store state can be selected, and part of the store state is users. So in our component, we can subscribe to those users whenever they're changed So in our component, we can subscribe to that users collection, and whenever it changes, we'll be notified. And we can do that up here by creating a public property called users $. So this is going to be an RxJS observable, which we're going to import, and it's going to be of type PT user array. Let's do all our imports and make sure that observable is coming from RxJS, because there's a lot of different things that are called observable. Now we need to initialize users in the constructor. So let's head down to the constructor and we'll say this dot users $. We're going to use the current store that we have, and we're going to select that slice of the store called users. You can think of this as an NGRX or Redux type of implementation. All your component cares about is binding the data to the users property here, and knowing that at some point in the future, this users property will deliver the results. So we're going to bind to it with the async pipe, and if at any time in the future the users list updates, it'll automatically update our list of users in the ComboBox. If we take a look at this now, you'll notice that we still don't have any users, and that's because we're not loading users yet. The users are going to be loaded asynchronously and on demand. So we're going to lazy load the users, because just in case we never really need to load the users, why load them? So on the ComboBox, we need some kind of event to let us know when to load the users, and the ComboBox provides a very handy event for that called open. I'm going to bind the open event to the user filter open function. This is when the ComboBox dropdown button is clicked. At that point, we'll load our users. So let's create the function right here in the code under the ng-on-init. I'm going to create a public function called userFilterOpen, and we're going to use the user service to fetch our users. This is expecting some kind of name filter, but we don't have a name filter, so I'm just going to pass in an empty string. So to summarize, the flow of events is as follows. The user is going to click on the ComboBox dropdown button, which is going to call this userFilterOpen function, and we're going to call the user service fetch users function, which is going to fetch the users from the API. And since we already have our local users property, which is an observable bound to the store's users property, we're going to get those users automatically in here. Let's take a look. I'm going to tap this button, and there we go. Now we have some objects in here. We're not exactly displaying them how we want, but the important thing here is that we're getting some data and the data flow is working as expected. So up until now in this chapter, we've been binding our dropdown list to arrays of strings. But here's an example of where we're going to bind to a list of objects instead, a list of users. We need their IDs and we need their names. And we also need their avatars. The ComboBox doesn't know which properties to display and which properties to use for identification, and so the ComboBox offers a couple of attributes that we're going to use to tell it which properties to display and which ones to use as the value. One of the attributes is text field. The text field is used to signify what property you actually want to display, and our user happens to have a full name property on the object, so we're going to set that. We also need to set the value field. This will tell the component what field has the ID that we're going to pass back as a selected option when one of the options is selected. And in our case, the user has the ID property. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. There we go. Now we're displaying the name of the user. And if I select one of these, the ID is going to be stored in the model of the component. What's nice about the ComboBox is that you can clear this too. You can even start typing and it'll find the name for you. Well, this is all great, but we still don't have the user images in there and our filtering is still not working. Let's get the filtering working first. We need some kind of event when we select the user. And the ComboBox has something called a value change event that gets triggered whenever we select one of the users. Let's bind that to user filter value change handler, and I'm going to pass in the event to that handler. Now we'll go and implement this in the code. I'm going to create a public function called userFilterValueChange, and that's going to take in a user, which is a PT user type or undefined. I'll explain that in a minute. So let's check to make sure we have a user, and if we do, we're going to set the filter user ID property to user.id. Otherwise, we'll set the filter user ID to undefined. If somebody unselects a user or hits that X in the combo box, undefined will be sent into this function, and the filter will not take into account a user ID, essentially resetting the filter, and at this point the filtering will be done only by date. Once we've updated the user ID in the filter, we're going to call the refresh function to fetch the data again. I'm going to filter by name right here, and you can see that our issues updated. If I pick somebody else, the active issues gets updated, and if I keep filtering by month, that filters the items even further based on the user's activity over the past year. So our filtering is working, which is great. I still want to add a little polish by showing the picture of the user next to each name. And this is where templates come into the combo box. Let's go back to our combo box, and for each item in the combo box, we can specify a template. This is similar to the way we did it with the drop-down list. We specify an ng template, and then the ng template has the Kendo ComboBox item template directive. Inside the template, we want to create a local variable, and we're going to call it user item. I'll also have a container div here with some bootstrap classes, and inside there we'll need a container for the image and another container for the name. Now, the important parts, the ones we're binding, are the source of the image, which is going to be useritem.avatar. It's going to point to the image file for that user. And for the span, we're binding useritem.fullname. You'll see that now we have the names and the avatars of these users. We just need to add a little bit more styling to fix up their sizing and positions. Now on the image, I already have a couple of predefined classes that you can just use. One of them is liAvatar, which will size them. And we'll also use rounded here to give them rounded corners. And for the positioning div, we'll use callAuto, which is a bootstrap class, and we'll use that for both the image container and the span container. Finally, all our hard work is going to pay off, I hope. Let's save this and take a look. Now we have the name along with the user avatars. So now we can filter by users and the dates, and everything looks good. Now, instead of using the image tag and having to style it, Kendo also provides a convenient avatar component that can be found under Layout, Avatar, and it's pretty much exactly what we're looking for. I'll leave that as an exercise to you, but if you want to use that, you would just drop in the Kendo avatar component instead of the image tag. So that takes care of the combo box. But our dashboard is not complete yet. We're getting some active issues at the top, but we don't have that fancy chart. We need to implement that as part of our requirements.